This is The Body's Compass with your host, Matt Sorensen. In episode 121, Matt talked about why pain keeps coming back. Today, Matt goes deeper into the mechanism behind it. The actual neurophysiology of how emotional experience gets into the body, where it lives, and why some people carry patterns for decades while others move through the same experience and come out the other side. Whether you're a therapist, a movement practitioner, a Baral or Czech student, or simply someone who suspects there's more to your own pattern than you've been told, this one is for you. Let's get into it.
Welcome back to The Body's Compass. I'm Matt Sorensen, and three episodes from now, episode 121, I talked about why pain keeps coming back, and if the responses I've been getting are anything to go by, that one landed. And a lot of you reached out asking for, some different versions of the same question. So, okay, Matt, I get it. The pain is coming from somewhere else. Something has been maintaining it beneath the level of the treatment. But how? How does something emotional, something psychological actually get into the body in the first place? And once it's there, why does it stay? So that's exactly what today is about. This is also looking at a version of the totem pole, the Czech totem pole, which if you see the Czech totem pole, you have the psyche up the very top. The mind is the builder. But what a lot of people don't really acknowledge or work with is the emotional totem. And as much of a can of worms as it is, how is the emotional state represented physically? Now, there's talks in manual therapy circles that that the emotions held in the fascia, that the emotions held in the muscle. Some neuroscientists say it's neither. Some say it's all. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And I've been noticing patterns for over 20 years now after studying all kinds of different manual therapies and psychology models and all that fun, exciting, nerdy stuff. So today I'm going to get into that mechanism. So this might be probably more aimed at manual therapists in general, Czech students in particular. And if you make it through this episode, if you are neither one of them, then it might be good to put on before bed, put you to sleep, and just enjoy the story. But today, I want to warn you up front, because what I'm about to share is going to challenge something most of us have been carrying without realizing it. And that's a hidden assumption about how the mind and the body relate to each other. An assumption that's so deeply embedded in the way we think about health and healing that most people never really question it. So the assumption is that emotions are mental events. They happen in the mind, and then sometimes they affect the body. That the body is often downstream of the psychology. That if you want to change the emotional pattern, you work with the mind, and then the body follows. I'm not saying there is no validity to that, but people only look at it that way. So I'm going to make the case today that it could be precisely backwards. Not that the mind doesn't matter, not that the psychological work isn't valuable. It absolutely is. I'm saying the relationship between emotion and the body is not what most of us think it is. and that the understanding of the real relationship, the actual neurophysiological mechanism, changes everything about how we approach what we call, let's say, the healing arts. So this episode is the mechanism, the how, the actual chain of events that connects an emotional experience to a physical pattern in the body, and it keeps it there. It's going to get a little scientific in places. I'll try and keep it as English as possible and clinical as I can, but stay with me, because by the end of this episode, you're going to have a completely different picture of what's happening in your body right now and why. So let's get into it. So firstly, we can talk about what some people call, a wrong model. So I want to start by dismantling something. Most people, including health practitioners, carry a model of emotion that goes something like this. Something happens, you feel something about it. That feeling, if it's strong enough or if it goes unresolved for long enough, starts to affect your body. Tight shoulders from stress, a knotted stomach from anxiety, a heavy chest from grief. In this model, the emotion comes first, in the mind, and then the body responds. The body is the effect. The emotion is the cause. And the way to resolve the body is to resolve the emotion through therapy, insight, understanding, processing. This model isn't wrong exactly, but it's a bit incomplete in a way that has potentially enormous clinical consequences. Here's what the neuroscience actually shows about that. Antonio Damasio, one of the world's most famous neuroscientists of the last 30 years, spent decades studying patients with brain damage that disconnected their emotional processing from their decision making. What he found turned the conventional model upside down. Damasio proposed what he called the somatic marker hypothesis. And essentially the core of that hypothesis is what we call an emotion is not a mental event that produces a bodily response. The emotion is the bodily response. The changes in visceral state, changes in vascular tone, hormonal milieu, and autonomic configuration that we associate with an emotional experience. Those changes are the emotion. They're not the consequence of it. They're the thing itself. And what we experience as a feeling, the conscious sense of being afraid or sad or anxious, is the brain's perception of those bodily changes. The feeling is the brain reading the body, not the body expressing the mind. So let me say that again, because kind of a big deal. The feeling is the brain reading the body. The emotion happens in the body first. The conscious experience of it, what we call the feeling, is essentially the brain's interpretation of what the body is doing. Now, A.D. Craig, a neuroscientist who spent his career mapping interoception, which is the brain's sense of the internal state of the body, took this even further. Craig showed that the anterior insula, a region of the cortex, is the primary site where visceral afferent signals are translated into conscious feeling. So an afferent signal is an inward signal from the brain, from the body directly into the brain. Also, that the subjective experience of emotion is literally constructed from the body's internal signals traveling upward through the nervous system to the brain. So you change the signals, you change the feeling. Lisa Feldman Barrett whose work on constructed emotion is, in my opinion, one of the most important in neuroscience today, showed that the brain doesn't passively receive emotional signals. It actively predicts and constructs emotional experience based on three things: prior history, current bodily state, and context. So that's prior history, current bodily state, and context. Two of those three are physical. They're in the body, which means the body isn't just where emotions show up. The body is where emotions are made. So this is the first thing I want you to kind of hold as we go through the rest of this. Not emotions in the mind affecting the body. Emotions constructed from the body, interpreted by the brain, producing a conscious result. So how does it get in? You're obviously asking. How does emotional experience get into the body? What's the actual mechanism? I'm going to walk you through it step by step. And I want you to follow this not just intellectually, but physically. See if you can feel any of it as I describe it. Now, something happens. It doesn't have to be catastrophic. It could be a significant loss, a moment of acute fear, a relationship that kept you in a low-grade state of threat for years, a childhood environment where you never quite felt safe, an accumulation of smaller stresses that may be never really fully resolved. Whatever the trigger, the moment it registers as threatening or overwhelming, the autonomic nervous system responds immediately, before conscious thought, before any psychological processing whatsoever. The sympathetic nervous system activates. Adrenaline and noradrenaline flood the system. Heart rate increases. Breathing becomes shallow and more rapid. Blood is redirected away from the digestive organs to the muscles and periphery. The liver dumps glucose into the bloodstream for immediate energy. The adrenal glands flood cortisol into the circulation. So this is the fight or flight response. And, it's ancient, but it is brilliant. It's designed to get you through an acute threat and then resolve, returning you to baseline when that danger or perceived danger has passed. But here's where it gets clinically interesting, arguably important. The sympathetic nervous system doesn't just activate broadly, it activates specifically. Sympathetic neurodendritic fibers, the nerve fibers carrying the sympathetic signal, directly innervate the smooth muscle walls of the arterioles and capillary sphincters that feed specific organs. They regulate the vascular tone of the organ feeding vasculature at a very, very fine level of detail. Different emotional states produce different emotional patterns of vascular change in different organs. Fear would produce one pattern, rage would produce another, grief another, prolonged grade low threat another. The body isn't just generally activated, it's specifically configured according to the nature of the emotional event. In an acute, resolved situation, the threat passes. The parasympathetic system comes back online. Vascular tone normalizes. Everything returns to baseline. But in situations of overwhelming stress, a single event that's too big to process, or repeated activation that never fully resolves, or a sustained chronic state of low-grade threat, the smooth muscle tone in the organ-feeding vasculature doesn't return to baseline. It stays where it is. It becomes the new baseline. The tissue holds a different resting tension now, a persistent altered state in the regulatory machinery of the visceral circulation. And over time, weeks, months, years, decades, this chronic alteration in vascular tone produces changes in the fascial envelope surrounding the organ. The connective tissue architecture around the organ, the fascial wrapping that holds it into place and gives it shape and connects it to surrounding structures, it becomes denser, becomes less mobile, more restricted. The organ itself loses its normal range of motion, its breathing rhythm, because every organ has a subtle one, a subtle mobility or motility that responds to the diaphragm, and the body's overall movement essentially becomes restricted. Its relationship to the surrounding structures, the diaphragm, the adjacent organs, the spinal ligaments, the psoas as another example, all becomes altered. And this is what Jean-Pierre Barral spent decades mapping, not necessarily pathology, not disease, the functional restriction of visceral mobility in response to the accumulation of life, stress, injury, surgery, emotions, etc. The physical record of what the body has been through written in the connective tissue of the organs, but also in the fascial envelope surrounding the capillary beds that feed into the organ. So the emotion isn't gone. It hasn't been processed and released. It's just been translated. It's been converted from a psychological experience into a physical architecture. It's now living in the density of the fascial envelope surrounding the liver. The vascular tone of the arterioles feeding the kidneys is another one. In the restricted breathing rhythm of the small intestine or the mesentery, it got into the body through the sympathetic nervous system, and it stayed by becoming structural. So why does it stay around? Now, here's the part that most people haven't really heard before. And this is the piece that I think probably explains more clinical complexity than anything else that I've encountered. Why does it stay? If the original stress is gone, if the difficult relationship has ended, if the loss, was grieved, if the threatening situation resolved, why does the pattern persist in the body? So why does, let's say, the liver stay restricted? Why does the vascular tone stay elevated? Why does the body keep bracing when there's nothing left to brace against? The answer lies in a structure most people have never heard of: baroreceptors. Baroreceptors are mechanosensitive receptors, pressure detectors, located in the walls of the arteries and in the walls of the visceral organs and the mesenteric vasculature that supplies them. Their primary job is to detect changes in the arterial wall stretch, which is a proxy for blood pressure, and it sent that information to the brainstem. Specifically, they send it to a structure called the nucleus tractus solitarius, or the NTS, in the medulla, in the brainstem. The NTS is in the brainstem's primary receiving station for information about the body's internal state. It receives baroreceptor signals that uses them to regulate cardiovascular function. So heart rate, vascular tone, blood pressure, through feedback loops that operate 24 hours a day without any conscious involvement. So I'd get this, so far it sounds like plumbing. Blood pressure regulation, not obviously related to emotional experience. But here's what the research of Dieter Vattel, Siegfried Schultz, and John Lacey revealed. And this is the piece that connects everything together. Baroreceptor firing rate directly modulates emotional processing. High baroreceptor activation, the pattern associated with good vascular tone and healthy autonomic regulation, it's associated with reduced amygdala reactivity, reduced pain sensitivity, dampened threat detection, a nervous system that can perceive threat without being overwhelmed by threat. Low or dysregulated baroreceptor firing, the pattern associated with chronic sympathetic dominance and altered vascular tone, does the opposite. It amplifies emotional reactivity. It sensitizes the pain system. It increases the amygdala's threat detection, making neutral stimuli feel threatening, making manageable stress feel completely overwhelming, making the body feel perpetually on guard, even when the conscious mind knows there's nothing to guard against. Now connect this to what we just established. Chronically elevated sympathetic tone produced by the persistent visceral vascular tension, that is the physical record of emotional history, creates chronically altered arterial pressure dynamics, which means chronically altered baroreceptor firing patterns, which means the NTS receives a continuous stream of abnormal pressure signals, which means the brainstem is continuously calibrated to a state of threat, not because anything threatening is happening right now, but because the physical architecture of the body is still configured as if it is. And the brainstem receiving this signal, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, now doesn't know the difference between a genuine threat and a visceral restriction that was laid down 15, 20 years ago. It responds to the signal and it maintains the autonomic set point that signal calls for. So this is a self-reinforcing loop. The emotional history produces visceral restriction. The visceral restriction alters baroreceptor afferents. The altered baroreceptor afferents recalibrates the brainstem towards chronic sympathetic dominance. The chronic sympathetic dominance maintains visceral vascular tension, which maintains the restriction, which maintains the altered baroreceptor signal. Round and round and round and round we go. Year after year, decade after decade, long after the original event is gone. This is essentially why it stays, not because the person hasn't gone through enough counseling or psychological work, not because they haven't tried hard enough to let it go, but because the physical substrate maintaining the pattern, the visceral restriction, the altered vascular tone, the abnormal baroreceptor signal has never been directly addressed. The insight is real, the processing is real, the understanding is real, but the tissue is still restricted. And as long as the tissue is restricted, the brainstem keeps receiving the same signal and keeps calibrating that signal accordingly. So what is this to the brain? So I want to spend a few minutes on what this chronic brainstem recalibration actually does to experience, because this is where the clinical picture becomes probably most recognizable. So the brainstem, recalibrated by years of abnormal baroreceptor afferents, develops what you might call a chronic stress set point. a default configuration that colors every experience that the person has. Three things happen as a result of this recalibration. And I want you to notice, listening now, whether any of these sound familiar. The first is pain amplification. The periaqueductal gray, or the PAG, is the structure in the midbrain that regulates descending pain modulation. It has the capacity to either dampen or amplify pain signals coming up from the body. In a well-regulated nervous system, the PAG keeps pain signals proportionate to the actual tissue state. In a chronically recalibrated brainstem, this PAG loses that modulatory capacity. Pain signals get amplified. Tissues that would produce mild discomfort in a well-regulated nervous system produce significant pain in a recalibrated one. So this is why two people can have identical findings on, let's say, an MRI, the same disc bulge, the same degeneration, and one is pain-free while the other is in complete agony. The scan tells you about the tissue. It tells you nothing about what the brainstem is doing with the signal from that tissue. So chronic pain is not just a tissue problem. It's a nervous system problem. And the nervous system problem, at least in part, is being driven by the baroreceptor signal from the visceral body. The second is emotional amplification. The amygdala, the brain's primary threat detection center, receives baroreceptor signals via the NTS thalamic pathway. In a chronically recalibrated state, the amygdala's threat threshold drops. It immediately begins to flag neutral stimuli as potentially threatening. It generates more emotional responses, anxiety, irritability, reactivity, a sense of low-grade dread that are disproportionate to the immediate situation, but entirely consistent with the visceral state driving them. So this is the person who knows intellectually that they're safe. Person whose life is objectively fine, but they can't stop the underlying current of anxiety, who overreacts to small things. The person who finds themselves emotionally flooded by things that really wouldn't or shouldn't flood them. This is the person whose nervous system seems to be running a threat program that their conscious mind cannot switch off. Because their conscious mind didn't switch it on, their visceral body did. The third is what I call perceptual narrowing. A brainstem calibrated to chronic threat begins to organize perception around survival. The range of experience that feels available, the capacity for joy, curiosity, rest, connection, creativity, love, it narrows. Not because those experiences aren't real or aren't possible, but because the nervous system is allocating all of its resources to vigilance rather than expansion. This is the person who used to feel more alive, more curious, more open, more present, and doesn't quite know when that changed or why, who finds rest difficult even when they have it. Person who feels like they're going through the motions of a life that should feel more full than it does. Again, not a psychological failure, it's a physiological state. A brainstem calibrated by years of abnormal visceral afference to a set point that simply doesn't have room for the full range of human experience. So I want to be careful here, not to sound like I'm reducing human suffering to a plumbing problem. These experiences are real, They are significant and they deserve to be met with care and depth. What I'm saying is that beneath the psychological experience, beneath the meaning and narrative and the emotional texture of it, there is a physical layer, a substrate, and that substrate is addressable directly with, of course, the right tools. So a clinical picture. Well, let me bring it back to the clinical picture with a story. I want to tell you about a client I had, I'll call Dave. In his mid-50s, came to me, chronic left hip pain that had been present for about 4 or 5 years. He'd had the full workup, imaging, physio, cortisone injections. Nothing had really produced lasting change. And then when I took, his history, not just the hip, but life, I learnt that Dave had lost his business about 6 years earlier, a significant financial collapse that came with enormous stress, enormous shame, and a period of genuine existential threat. He described it as the 2 hardest years of his life. He'd worked through it, seen a therapist, rebuilt financially, moved forward. He convinced himself, to have processed it. His hip pain had started about 18 months after the business collapse. On assessment, I found restriction in his left kidney, the kidney that sits adjacent to the psoas, left psoas, which connects to the spine, connects the spine to the hip. I found chronic sympathetic dominance, his heart rate variability significantly below what I'd expect for someone his age and fitness level. And I found bilateral blood pressure asymmetry of 22 millimeters of mercury, the left arm running significantly higher than the right, and his pulse on his right posterior tibial pulse was weaker than on the left. The kidney restriction was pulling on the psoas through the renal fascia as it continues through. The psoas, chronically loaded, was altering the mechanics of the left hip, and the whole system was being maintained by a nervous system still calibrated to the threat state of 6 years previously, because the visceral body had never returned to baseline, even though the conscious mind had moved on, but unconsciously not, or subconsciously. 4 sessions, visceral work on the kidney, autonomic regulation support, some specific movement retraining. The hip pain resolved from a 8 out of 10 to a 2 out of 10. His heart rate variability improved. And he said something to me in our 4th session that I've actually, for some reason, it's sort of stuck with me. He said, I feel like my body has been holding its breath for 6 years and it's just started to breathe again. Not a metaphor, that is a physiological description of what actually had happened. His body had been holding literally and structurally the configuration of a threat state that his mind had long since moved past. And when we address the physical substrate, the breath, the full, free, easy breath, it came back. So that's the mechanism we've been talking about today. That is how emotion essentially gets into the body. And that is why when you address the right level, it can come out again. So what does this mean for you? I want to close today with something practical, because I don't want you to walk away from this episode feeling like your body is a prison of everything you've ever done or thought or experienced. It's not. The mechanism I've described is real, but it is also very reversible. So that's the whole point. If you're someone who has been carrying a pattern, physical or emotional or both, that hasn't responded to the good work you've done on it, I want to offer you 3 questions to sit with for now. The first question is, what was happening in your life in the period before this pattern started? Not necessarily immediately before. Sometimes there's a delay of months, sometimes years between the emotional event and the physical manifestation. As the restriction builds gradually and the baroreceptor signal drifts slowly towards that new set point, but there's almost always something, a loss, a period of sustained threat, a relationship that kept the nervous system braced, a time when the body never quite got to rest. The second question, where in your body does this pattern live? Not just the site of the pain or maybe even the tension, but where else? Where else feels restricted? Where else feels dense, guarded? The right shoulder, right side of the upper abdomen, lower back, the gut, the chest, the throat. The body often tells a coherent story if you're willing to listen to the whole of it, rather than just the loudest part. The third question is, have you ever addressed the body at the level of the organ and artery? Not muscles and joints, not even the nervous system directly, but the organs and arteries themselves, the mobility, the fascial architecture, the relationship to surrounding structures. If the answer is no, and for most people it is no, because most of us haven't really ever been offered that or know what it is, then there may be a level of the pattern that simply hasn't been touched yet. And that's not criticism of anything that you've done. It's an invitation to go one level deeper. In the next episode of this, let's call it mini-series, I'm going to bring this all the way home to the practical question. If this is the mechanism, if emotional patterns live in the body at the level of visceral restriction and altered baroreceptor afferents, then what do you actually do about it? What are the interventions that reach this level? And what does a whole person approach look like when it's built on this understanding rather than on the conventional model? But I'll also be honest about what each type of intervention can and can't reach. Because I think one of the most valuable things I can offer, it's not a sales pitch for one approach, but an honest map of what different kinds of work actually do and what level they operate and where they need to be combined with something else. So I think that episode is going to be the most practically useful thing I've put out on this show. And I am looking forward to it. So until then, I'll leave you something. David? Steve? David? Let's go with David. What he said to me, not about the breathing thing. Oh, I did like that. Something he said right at the end of one of our sessions, just as he's putting his he was putting his shoes on. He said, I always thought I was the kind of person who holds things. I thought that was just who I was. Maybe I was just a person whose body had never been shown how to put them down. For him, that's pretty prophetic. So your body knows how to put things down. Sometimes it just takes the right kind of help to let it remember. So thanks for making it this far. Thanks for joining. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.
That's a wrap for this episode of The Body's Compass with Matt Sorensen. If this conversation shifted something for you, even slightly, that's the mechanism working. Your body is already listening differently than it was an hour ago. If you want to go deeper, not just understand this, but actually apply it to your own body or your clinical practice, Matt would love to have you in the Inner Circle. It's a live group call with Matt every fortnight where you bring your questions, your cases, your patterns, and we work through them together. Real answers, not generic advice. Check out healhub.net/The Inner Circle for more details. Follow Matt on Instagram at The Body's Compass. Subscribe on YouTube at Matt Sorensen Live. And if this episode was worth your time, leave us a review. It genuinely helps more people find the show. As always, thanks for listening. Catch you next time.